Hello again, I am Blunty. This is the MSI Gaming Z Series GeForce GTX 1070. The Z, or possibly Z series, is MSI's cream of the crop branding. In Dragon Ball Z terms, or Dragon Ball Z, think of it as their final form. And as you can see, it's kicking MSI's badass looking and damn fine performing Twin Freezer 5 cooler. Or should that be Twin Freezer 5 cooler if we're going to continue with the Dragon Ball Z gag? Which, aside from making MSI's offering noticeably chunkier than many cards of this ilk, it is also responsible for the superb cooling efficiency that means you should be able to nail down some real nice overclocking without compromises on fan noise. On that score, the fans have that sweet 0 dB mode we all love so much, stalling out completely when under low and moderate loads, when the core temperatures are at 60 degrees C or below, which means of course utter silence. I'll come back to fan noise under load in a minute. But elsewhere around the cooler we find the red slashes on the dark half of the cooler actually light up, sadly in red only, in keeping with MSI's flag colours of course. I feel it would have been nice to get some RGB options in there, but I understand why they're red, it's part of the brand ID. You do, however, get RGB options over on the sweet backplate logo, which I guess for most people is more important anyway. In my case, with the card unusually mounted vertically, I don't actually get to see it. But in 90% of builds, the backplate is of course what you're likely to see when you look through the window on your case, so the slick little RGB dragon logo is actually pretty awesome detail. The backplate itself is nickel-plated copper for a bit of extra heat dissipation assistance. The board is of course a custom PCB with 10-phase power and an additional 6-pin power socket over the standard 1070 design, obviously to give you more juice to keep those overclocks nice and stable. The heat pipes are nice and chunky, 8mm, and with a squared-off design for maximised heat transfer. They use a special premium thermal compound, apparently, and special attention has been paid to cooling of the memory and MOSFETs, so at least in theory, everything here is tailored to maximum performance, minimum temperatures. Now, as for the card's performance itself, a stock GTX 1070 turbo clocks to 1683 MHz. A standard retail unit of MSI's Gaming Z GTX 1070 is factory overclocked at 1835 MHz turbo clock, and if you hit the OC button in the software, it'll kick that up even further to 1680 MHz. In my case though, as this is a review sample, as you can see right there in MSI Afterburner, MSI have actually sent it to me pre-overclocked even further. And they were, by the way, quite clear about this in the documentation they sent with it, so no conspiracy here, folks. And hey, quite frankly, I doubt anyone who invests in a top-end card like this isn't going to overclock it anyway, or at least going to switch into the default OC mode option themselves. So yeah, just to be clear, the benchmarks and gameplay I'll be showing you here are at this speed, and I'll come back to what I got from pushing this card even further with my own manual overclock later in the video. The Heaven benchmark churns out a score of 3032, Valley pushes out 4793, average FPS of 114, maxing at 196 FPS. Rise of the Tomb Raider in DX12 mode benchmarks at 107 FPS overall, maxing to 172 FPS. Just Cause 3 gameplay, again with everything maxed out, swims from 70 FPS to 170 FPS and spending most of its time in the triple digits. Project Cars, with all the bells and whistles turned on, racing through drizzle, averages at about 120 FPS or so. Witcher 3, with all the options pushed past even the stock ultra settings, like for example maxing out hairworks even further, hovers around 70 FPS, spiking to triple digits and diving to as low as about 66 FPS. And finally, Doom. For these tests, using Vulkan, it swims along, hovering at either side of 150 FPS or so. For my own manual overclock, I got it pumped up to 2062 MHz. I did get a few test runs at 2088, but it wasn't consistently stable. It was stable-ish. It would only crash sometimes, but it would still crash, so I rolled it back. And I sped up the DDR5X memory a further 600 MHz. Now, as with any overclocking, the variance in individual chips, aka the silicon lottery, will mean different cards overclock slightly differently, and the OC I got stable on this card is pretty nice, but actually a little below the 2100-ish speeds I was hoping for that I've seen some other silicon lottery winners squeeze out of their 1070s. And for perspective, once again, Nvidia's stock boost clock for the GTX 1070 is 1683 MHz, so my 2062 is just shy of a 380 MHz boost over that. Not insignificant at all, eh? But the story here is actually less about the biggest number and more about getting a significant, useful overclock and having it run cool and quiet. And that's where the MSI is outstanding, as even with the voltage and power limits pushed right up and the clock pushed right up to the red line of stability under full benchmarking maxed out load, the MSI cooler kept this card at 71 degrees. And it did that with the fans at a still whisper quiet 55% speed, or about 1300 RPM or below. And that 71 degrees is a long way from the thermal cap where throttling would kick in and slow the card down so it doesn't cook itself. So you are getting the full benefit of that overclock 100% of the time. No slowdowns ever. And again, it's doing all that while the card is practically silent, even in my open air case where the card is literally right behind my head. In benchmarks, that overclock brings the Heaven score up another 300 points and another 10 FPS also. The Valley score sings the same tune on the FPS boost and the overall score jumps up more than 500 points. The 4K Firestrike Ultra score also show a 300 point boost, and the DX12 based Time Spy benchmark jumps from 5,787 to 6,174. And as we look at the rise of the Tomb Raider difference, it's worth reminding you what you're seeing is my manual overclock versus the MSI reviewer overclock. The difference to stock clocks, or even the difference to the standard mode the retail cards ship in, is even more significant. Just Cause 3 sees a boost commonly more than 10 FPS above the MSI OC. And Project Cars sees up to a 25 FPS boost or so, but most commonly around 10 FPS or so. Interestingly, Witcher 3 saw a much subtler boost, but still got a boost. And finally, Doom. And like The Witcher, the difference is more difficult to spot, partly because the FPS in this game fluctuates so quickly, and partly because it's hard to do a like-for-like play in this game. I would really deeply love this game to have a standardized benchmark test. Now, a new one to my suite of tests, No Man's Sky. It's a dumb game to use as a benchmark, I'll be quite honest with you. It's still far too broken and glitchy, and it needs patching, and it has a ton of variables, but doing like I've done here, a simple gameplay sequence, same planet, same settings, we can at least get a useful relative comparison against itself, with the only core variable being my overclock over MSI's reviewer overclock. And as you can see, the difference here wasn't that huge, but it certainly was measurable. In any case, the point here is the overclock on the MSI Gaming Z GTX 1070 was significant over stock clocks. And again, it did it without even needing to ramp up the fans past about half speed and without reaching past 70 degrees or so. And that is the significant achievement. Overclocking is fun and all, but it's only really practical and useful if you don't pay for that boost in performance with too much noise or excessive heat that puts strain on the components and stuff.
Just by way of demonstration about how quiet this is, I am now whispering just next to the camera here, where the microphone is, and you can clearly hear me above the non-noise that this card makes, even while overclocked and under load.
But yeah, that's the story of the MSI Gaming Z, or Gaming Z, GeForce GTX 1070. It's chunky, it looks pretty badass, it's got a nifty backplate light-up logo thingy back there, it kicks the ever-living hell out of games, it overclocks really very nicely, and most importantly, it does it all very quietly. And it does all this keeping a very cool head thanks to MSI's beefy cooler design. If you are after a high-end GTX 1070 that you'll know you'll get nice sweet overclocks out of, and especially if your rig smacks a black and red color scheme around, I am thusly happily pointing you towards the MSI Gaming Z flavor of GTX 1070. It does all the things I like a GPU to do, mainly kick ass and shut up while doing it. Thanks for watching, I am Blunty, and I will catch you next time.